The first rule of managing a ghost is to never let it know you can see it. For 10 years, I had managed the ghost of my husband, Daniel, with the precision of a museum curator. His ghost wasn't a spectral form that rattled chains in the dead of night. It was an atmospheric pressure, a lingering scent of old books and pipe tobacco that clung to the velvet curtains in the library of the Salt Spray Inn. It was the weight of his absence in the empty chair across from me at breakfast. I had curated my life around this ghost, keeping it placid, undisturbed. Then Julian Croft arrived, and he didn't just see my ghost. He walked straight through it, and in doing so, threatened to wake the one I had buried in myself. The hook wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a slow, creeping thing, like the insidious fog that rolled in from the Atlantic to swallow our corner of the Maine coastline whole. Julian had been a resident at the inn for nearly a month, a long-term booking in the desolate heart of late autumn when the tourists had fled and the world had shrunk to the cry of gulls and the groan of old timber. He was a writer, he'd said, seeking refuge from the city's relentless noise. He was 28, with eyes that held the weary shadow of someone much older, and a quiet intensity that felt less like peace and more like a tightly coiled spring. He kept to himself, taking long, brooding walks along the cliff paths and spending hours hunched over his laptop in the dim light of his room. He was just a guest, a shadow passing through. That was the lie I told myself until the afternoon the storm hit. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a furious, violent assault. Wind howled like a banshee, rattling the century-old window panes in their frames. The lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the inn into a profound, suffocating darkness. The silence that followed was broken only by the tempest outside and the frantic, sudden hammering of my own heart. I found him in the great room, standing before the cavernous fireplace, his silhouette limned by the weak, gray light from the storm-thrashed windows. "The generator won't kick on," I said, my voice sounding thin, swallowed by the vastness of the room. "The lines must be down all the way to town." He turned not with a start, but with a slow, deliberate grace that was unnervingly calm. I figured as much. He gestured toward the hearth. "Do you have firewood?" That's how it started. Not with pie dough and flour, but with splintered logs and the primal necessity of heat and light. We worked in a strange, unspoken tandem. I held the oil lamp while he hauled wood from the covered porch, his shoulders straining against the wet fabric of his sweater. He coaxed a flame from the kindling with a patience I found mesmerizing, his long fingers careful and sure. The fire caught, spitting and hissing, casting our dancing shadows against the wood-paneled walls. The room filled with the scent of pine and smoke, a living smell that momentarily pushed back the sterile ghost of tobacco and time. We were kneeling on the hearth, side by side, watching the flames lick at the logs. His hand, reaching for the poker, brushed against mine. It was nothing. An accident of proximity in the dark. But it was also everything. A current, stark and electric, jolted up my arm. Time seemed to warp, the roar of the storm outside fading to a distant hum. He froze. His gaze lifted from the fire to my face, and his eyes, illuminated by the flickering orange light, held an expression of such raw, unguarded surprise that it mirrored the shock coursing through my own veins. It was a look of pure, unadulterated awareness. He saw me, not Eleanor Vance, the stoic 47-year-old widow and proprietor of a failing inn. He saw a woman. Neither of us moved. Neither of us breathed. The moment stretched, taut and fragile, before he finally pulled his hand away, the spell breaking. But the residue of it remained, a shimmering, dangerous energy in the air between us. I'll go find some candles for the kitchen," I stammered, rising too quickly. My knees protested, a sharp reminder of my age, of the chasm of years that lay between us. I fled, not from him, but from the sudden, terrifying resurrection of a feeling I thought had been buried with my husband. The rest of the evening unfolded in a dreamlike state of heightened sensation. We made dinner together in the kitchen, our movements dictated by the small wavering pools of candlelight. Every accidental brush of his arm as he passed behind me in the narrow space was a brand. Every time he leaned in to ask where the salt was, his clean, rain-damp scent, a mix of wool and something uniquely, youthfully male, was an assault on my carefully constructed peace. We ate grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup heated on the old gas stove, a meal of rustic simplicity that felt more intimate than any fine dining I had ever experienced. The silence was thick with unspoken words, with the ghost of that moment by the fire. He broke it, his voice low and soft. "Are you all right, Eleanor?" I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Just thinking. The storm." It was a weak excuse, and we both knew it. "You have a look," he said, leaning back in his chair, studying me in the candlelight. "The one people get when their thoughts are louder than the room." I forced a laugh, a brittle sound. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" he challenged gently. "I think you do." After dinner, he insisted on helping with the dishes, washing them by hand in the deep farmhouse sink. I stood beside him, drying, our elbows occasionally knocking. The simple domesticity of the act was unnerving. It felt natural, frighteningly so. "Thank you for letting me stay here," he said out of the blue, his back to me. "I mean, really stay, not just rent a room." His words pierced through my defenses. I hadn't realized until that moment how hollow my routines were, how the inn wasn't a home but a mausoleum I dutifully maintained. I'm glad you're here," I admitted, the truth of it surprising me. Later we sat in the great room, a bottle of red wine breathing on the small table between us. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing embers and the storm had eased into a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. I huddled on one end of the worn leather sofa. He sat on the other, swirling the wine in his glass. "What were you running from?" I asked, the question bolder than I intended, fueled by wine and the strange intimacy of the blackout. He was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. "A different kind of ghost," he finally said. "A spectacular failure. A relationship that ended so badly, it felt like it had torched my entire life. I came here to see if there was anything left in the ashes." He finally looked at me, his eyes dark with a pain that seemed too vast for his years. "Ever feel like you've been living in the ruins of something for so long, you've forgotten how to build?" "All the time," I whispered, the words pulled from a place deep inside me. And there it was, a bridge of shared wreckage spanning the gulf of our ages. Something had irrevocably shifted. The foundation of my quiet, predictable world had cracked. I went to bed that night in my cold, empty room, the storm outside a pale imitation of the one raging inside me. I stared at the ceiling, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, not with guilt, but with a terrifying, exhilarating confusion. How do you mourn a ghost while your body is coming back to life? The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the world in a clean, watery light. The power was still out. The quiet was absolute. I found Julian in the kitchen, shirtless, a pair of worn gray sweatpants hanging low on his hips. He was attempting to make coffee with a French press, his brow furrowed in concentration. His back was to me, a landscape of smooth skin and taut muscle that was achingly, beautifully alive. He turned as I entered, a sheepish smile on his face. "Morning. I'm not sure I'm winning," he said, holding up the press. My robe felt suddenly flimsy, inadequate. I pulled it tighter. "It's a process." He made the coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, the silence from the night before returning, but different now. It was no longer heavy with tension, but fragile with possibility. "Eleanor," he began, his voice serious as he set his mug down. "About last night." "We don't have to talk about it," I interrupted, a coward's retreat. "I think we do," he countered gently but firmly. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable. But I have to be honest. When I touched your hand, I felt something I haven't felt in a very long time. Maybe ever. It wasn't just a spark. It felt like coming home." My breath hitched. "Julian, you're my guest. You're 28 years old." The words sounded absurd as I said them, a litany of rules for a game that had already changed. "And you're 47, he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. You're also the most real person I've met in my entire life. Do you think a decade or two matters more than that?" He leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "I'm not trying to start something complicated. I don't want to pretend I didn't feel it. I know you felt it too." He was right. Denying it would be the greatest lie of all. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I felt it." A slow, relieved breath escaped his lips. He didn't press. He didn't move closer. He simply held my gaze, and in that shared look, an understanding was forged. We were two survivors, adrift on the same sea, who had just found the same piece of driftwood. That afternoon I decided to walk, not through the manicured lanes of a quiet neighborhood, but along the treacherous cliff path that bordered the inn's property. The wind was still fierce, whipping my hair across my face and tasting of salt. The ocean crashed against the rocks below, a symphony of violent beauty. I needed the raw power of it to match the turmoil inside me. I wasn't ashamed of the feeling Julian had woken in me. I was terrified of it. It was a betrayal of Daniel, of the quiet vows of widowhood I had unknowingly taken. And yet, it felt more honest than anything I had done in 10 years. When I returned, chilled to the bone but strangely clear-headed, I found him in the library. He had lit a new fire and the room was warm and inviting. He was standing by the shelves, running his fingers over the spines of Daniel's books. "He must have been an amazing man," Julian said without turning around. "He was," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. "He was my whole world." "Was," Julian repeated softly, finally facing me. "Eleanor, you're allowed to build a new one." The storm inside me broke. I sank onto the ottoman, and the tears I had held back for a decade finally came. I wept for Daniel, for the life we'd lost. I wept for the years I had spent as a ghost in my own home. I wept from the terror and the beauty of feeling something new. Julian didn't rush to comfort me. He let me grieve. He stood by the fire, a silent, patient sentinel, giving me the space I needed. When the sobs subsided, he came and knelt before me, taking my hands in his. They were warm and strong. "I'm not trying to replace him," he said, his voice a low thrum that vibrated through me. "No one ever could. I'm just here. Now." He leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. Our lips met, and it wasn't a kiss of frantic passion, but of profound, heartbreaking tenderness. It was a kiss of recognition, of solace. It tasted of salt from my tears and smoke from the fire. It was slow and deep and respectful, a question and an answer all in one. He held my face in his hands as if it were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine. The howl of the wind outside was a distant echo. In the warm, firelit library, with the ghost of my husband watching over us, I felt the last of my own icy defenses melt away. He left 2 days later, after the power was restored and the roads were cleared. There was no awkwardness, no frantic promises. The kiss in the library had settled something between us. We stood on the porch, the air crisp and clean. "I don't want this to be a secret we keep from a storm," he said. I nodded, my heart full. "Neither do I." "Can I call you?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "Can we see what this is, slowly, without a map?" "I'd like that," I said, and this time my smile felt real. He kissed me one last time, a soft, promising press of his lips, and then he was gone, his car disappearing down the long, winding drive. I stood on the porch for a long time, watching the space where he had been. The inn felt different. It was no longer a tomb. It was just a house, waiting for a new life to be lived within its walls. I don't know where this road will lead. It is a path fraught with judgment, complexity, and the ghosts of what people believe is right or wrong. But what happened in the heart of that storm did more than just leave me breathless. It resurrected me. It taught me that the deepest connections are not bound by time or convention, but are forged in the shared truth of our broken pieces. And for the first time in a decade, I am not afraid of the ghosts. I am choosing to live, to feel, to let the unexpected become something sacred. Because some feelings aren't meant to be buried. They are meant to be the very things that prove you survived.